really quickly at level 1 what you think this poem is about before we actually talk about it. The brilliance of this poem is that it gives way to lots of interpretations. Okay? There are many readers of the poem who discover early on that all you have to do to make the poem more meaningful is to take the word anyone out and to substitute a name. Right? Anyone lived in a pretty how town. He sang his didn't. He danced his did. Tells you that anyone is male. So you just put a male name there, whatever. For example, watch how this works. Steve lived in a pretty how town. Steve sang his didn't. He danced his did. Okay? Then, as you continue to read the poem, you're going to recognize that that anyone, Steve, finds someone to love and marries that someone, but that someone's name is no one. So it begs the obvious question, what's up with anyone and no one? Jot down what you think is going on there. Why does Cummings identify the guy and the girl in the poem? Many have said this is one of the prettiest love poems that we read. I'm inclined to agree with them because this is a poem that suggests that this is what life is really all about. Notice the seasonal effect, the cyclical effect. All right, let's work through the poem's stanzas and see if we can figure out what's going on here. Anyone lived in a pretty how town. Of course, the word how here has all kinds of implications. Some critiquers of this poem have pointed out that the word how and the word cow are very closely aligned. A cow town, that is to say, in the country. Some will say, you gotta appreciate the word pretty here as it relates to the word how. In other words, anyone, the hero of our poem, if you can say it that way, lived in a pretty little town. The word how, of course, changes all kinds of meanings. Notice with the parenthetics. With up, so floating, many bells down. Lots and lots of different renderings of what this one means. Of course, one understanding of this is the ringing of church bells. We have a small community. Again, those of us living in a small community can appreciate this notion of nobody or anyone living in the middle of a small town nowhere. And then you have the first introduction of the cyclical nature. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. And often poets and writers, Shakespeare clearly doing this as well, talks about how you're living your life like it's in a year, right? So the beginning of your life is in the spring, then you go to the middle of your life in your summer, and then you have the fall of your life, that's when you start to get old, and then the winter of your life is when you die, right? He sang his didn't, he danced his did. Seems to suggest that we've got a situation here where there's things that he didn't do and things that he did do. That is to say, he lived a normal life, we might say. Women and men, both little and small, cared for anyone, not at all. There seems to be a suggestion here that anyone is unknown even within his own community. They sowed their isn'ts, they reaped their same. That is to say, he was somewhat maybe outside the social circle. Sun, moon, stars, rain. Notice the in rhyme, obviously, to play along with this sort of like sing-songy kind of rhythm. Children guessed, but only a few. And down they forgot, as up they grew. Autumn, winter, spring, summer. In other words, children understood something very special about anyone. This person who lives in this pretty how town. But as they got older, the children began to increasingly forget how special maybe anyone was. We're back, of course, to the autumn, winter, spring, summer. Again, that notion of cyclical nature. The children guessed that no one loved him, right? And here we are again with this second person, right, of the poem. No one loved him more by more. Notice the brilliance of more by more as opposed to more and more. When by now and tree by leaf, she laughed his joy, she cried his grief. In other words, no one, right, identifies with him. She loves him. Bird by snow and stir by still, anyone's any was all to her. In other words, he found someone, no one, right, who completely adored him in every way. Someone's married their everyone's, laughed their cryings, and did their dance, sleep, wake, hope, and then they said their nevers. They slept their dream. Stars, rain, sun, moon. And only the snow can begin to explain how children are apt to forget to remember, with up so floating many bells down. Again, this powerful notion of the cyclical nature of life. Children grow up to become adults in small towns to look very much like, guess what? The adults who live in those small towns. The poem, of course, will take an interesting turn at line 25. One day, anyone died. Now, the I guess is interesting. The I guess almost seems to suggest that the speaker of our poem kind of had a distanced view, right, of these two, and says, I guess that's what happened to anyone. He was not so well known, right, to be remembered in his passing. But no one was there when anyone died. No one stooped to kiss his face. Busy folk buried them side by side, little by little, and was by was, all by all, and deep by deep, and more by more, they dream their sleep. No one and anyone, earth by April, wish by spirit, and if by yes. This is a creative way for Cummings to say that everything moves in its cycle, right? Everything goes in accordance with its cycles. Now we'll finish with an observation about this pretty how town. Women and men, both dong and ding, summer, autumn, winter, spring, reaped their sowing, and went their came, sun, moon, stars, rain. Of course, the idea here, right, is that there's almost like a dream logic to this poem at the end of the poem, and everyone in the poem, in the town, is going to live their life, maybe connected, maybe somewhat disconnected, and yet notice the central powerful image here is that anyone found no one, and they lived together and they died together, buried in graves side by side. All right, let's jump to 2A really quickly. What's a possible message or theme here that you want to jot down for this one? Some students have pointed out that Cummings is kind of making fun of people who live in small towns like ours, right? That, everyone knows everyone's business, right? Everyone gets into everyone's business. Everyone has an opinion about everyone's business. And Cummings is kind of making fun of that. A second rendering of this poem, however, is to see it quite the opposite. To say, no, that's not it at all. Cummings is really celebrating the fact that, in the same way that you have spring, summer, fall, winter, you have the life of a small town. This is the way it works. Children grow up, and they don't leave the community for very long, if at all, and then they come back to, guess what? Become old and raise their own children. It's always fascinating to ask high school seniors, juniors, and seniors, when you leave high school, are you going to leave this community and ever come back to this community? And some students will say, dude, I'm never coming back here. Only to discover, guess what? 5, 10 years later, guess what? They're back again. Some of my students have pointed out, small towns are like magnets that seem to kind of draw us back. And this poem seems to celebrate why that's the case. Well, what follows summer? Winter. Well, what follows leaving a small town? Returning to that small town, you see. There's a third reading of this poem at level 2A, and it's to see this poem as a true love poem. If you can find a single person in your life with whom to share your life, to grow old with, you will have done something quite remarkable. You will have done something as natural as the seasons. Let's turn now to 2B. Again, this is powerful stuff for Cummings. Notice all of the games he's able to play. Anybody can come right out and write a poem celebrating what he's celebrating or critiquing what he's critiquing. But to play the game of the syntax and the grammar and the vocabulary and the word order, all of those are going to be characteristic of E.E. Cummings. It is my hope that as we read, for example, these poems, that you'll be so interested in reading more of, for example, Cummings' work, that you go online and take a look at a number of his other poems. Okay, let's turn now to 3A really quickly, and the observations that can be made. Some students will point out that there's some similarities here between this kind of poetry and the images poetry that we were studying from before. There is some have pointed out, there's powerful relationships between this kind of writing and the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Dickinson loves also syntax and word games. Go back to some of that stuff that we were playing with Emily Dickinson. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, for example. Of course, we can ask this question: what is for you your favorite movie that celebrates small town and provincial life? Right? Let's turn now to 3B and the observations that can be made about this. Do you find it the case that in small towns it's a good thing or a bad thing to live in a small town? It's interesting what adults will say about, for example, the town of Worland. It's a great place. You can finish it with me because you know it, and maybe some of you loathe it. It's a great place to raise kids. Of course, when you speak to kids who are living in this town, they will often report, really? What makes this such a great place to raise kids? I mean, really? You know, there's not a lot to do. It's kind of boring and everybody knows everybody's business. Well, it begs the question, jot it down in your notes, why do you think adults are always talking about this being a great place to raise kids? One student has pointed out the reason they say this is because we can't get away with anything. Because there's no such thing as anonymity in a small town. Everybody knows everybody's business. Of course, within this poem, you also, though, have this notion of finding your significant other, someone who you want to spend your life with, someone who you hope you could be buried side by side with someday long, long from now. Is that something that you hope for at all? And if so, why do you hope for that? And, of course, the ultimate question, how will you know when you're, as anyone, have met your no one? How will you know when you've met your anyone or your no one? What will be the key indicators? It will be an interesting observation that whoever he or she is, one would hope that there will be someone to stoop and kiss your face at the moment of your passing. This is a powerful word picture, isn't it? Right? Well, there you go. The joy of E.E. Cummings' lovely poetry. Thank you.